Old Westerns on the movie screen often depicted a stereotypical view of cowboys and Indians. First Americans were usually the villains. Or in a best-case scenario, they were the stoic sidekicks to the cowboy heroes, usually the ones to take a bullet. But in 19th century Indian Territory, first American lawmen were the heroes. Riding the trail alone, severely outnumbered, and with a system of justice that didn't always have their back. They were peacemakers, as well as judge, jury, and executioner. Many of their stories have been long forgotten in the dust of the prairie, until now. This is their story. They were brave, tenacious, and of the highest integrity. They rode alone, covering hundreds of miles to carry out their mission, protecting the Chickasaw people in Indian Territory. They were the Chickasaw Lighthorsemen, Indian Police.
The term light horse, scholars say it came from General Lighthorse Harry Lee. That was his nickname.
Now, light horse has different meanings in different cultures. The English would still be using the, quote, light horse to mean light cavalry, as opposed to heavy cavalry.
I've talked to modern-day light horse. They feel like it might have come from the fact that these men packed lightly and were extremely fast on their horses. So there's a couple of different interpretations for the name light horse, but we know that all 5 tribes had the name light horse, and that's what they called their mounted police force.
Chickasaw lawmen in Indian Territory followed a cultural code for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Societal bonds were so tight, pervasive crime was not an issue, and procedures were in place to keep the peace, with both harsh punishments as well as forgiveness.
This goes all the way back to our homelands. It goes back to our annual green corn ceremony. You would go forward before the council and confess your wrongs and any crimes you had committed. If it was murder, then it was an eye for an eye, and retribution would be made upon the murderer by the closest family member of the victim. So if I killed somebody, then the family member would in turn kill me. And you had time to prepare for your death up to a year afterwards. And then you were expected to return, and they did, and that carried over even into Indian Territory.
In Indian Territory, those condemned to death would receive a designated date to return for their execution. Some could even request a friend or family member to carry out the execution.
In reflecting part of that traditional Chickasaw culture, and it'd be the same among the Choctaws, among the Seminoles and the Cherokees, Muskogee Creeks, is this code of honor.
That just shows the character of the people, the character of the Chickasaws.
It was a matter of honor to return on that prescribed day.
And there are many instances where it's been proven that individual members of these tribes would come back to accept their punishment. Otherwise, it would have been disgrace.
It just says that that standard of honor, whether you are guilty of a crime or not guilty of a crime, otherwise there was no place for you in that society.
The Southeastern Indian system of justice carried over into Indian Territory after removal beginning in the 1830s. The Chickasaw Lawmen joined the Choctaw Lawmen in a combined territory.
There wasn't a lot of crime initially.
But it didn't take long for non-native people to seek opportunity in Indian Territory, complicating an already challenging situation as Chickasaws worked to reestablish their communities.
You had to have permits to live in Indian Territory, so if you didn't have a permit, you were considered an intruder.
The federal government promised a solemn treaty that they would keep these intruders out. Intruders would have been considered anybody who was not a Chickasaw citizen or there with a permit from the Chickasaw Nation. But it didn't work that way. When the 5 civilized tribes signed treaties with the United States to move west, they're bringing their culture, their forms of government, their forms of law enforcement, their ideas of sense of community, the way you dealt with the land, the way you deal with your neighbors. They will be agents out in the field.
Particularly when talking about the Light Horsemen, they were chosen for their high standards of morality, of trust and respect. They were individuals who people could entrust a responsibility to make fair judgments. In the very early period, a light horseman was judge, jury, and executioner.
They would enforce the law, they would prosecute, they would adjudicate, they would correct. All of these powers in the form of one agent.
The first thing I think about whenever I think about the light horse from the old days is the bravery that they had. Men that were the light horse back then, they worked by themselves, and whenever they chased down the bad guys, they had to go after them alone.
They carried with them usually a rifle and a pistol. They carried with them a knife sometimes. They would carry their saddlebags on their horses. Their horses were very important, so in those saddlebags, they would have supplies for the horses. They also had hope saddles on their horses. It was a special kind of saddle. It was very popular at the time. So it was supposed to be a little lighter, and that can make your horse a lot faster. Then the most important thing is their handcuffs. Some of the main duties in Indian Territory that the Chickasaw Light Horse had were enforcing the no alcohol laws. So they would have to confiscate liquor coming across the border, for example, from Texas. That was a big issue. And then they would take that liquor and dump it out at the Capitol in Tishomingo, and you'd get paid for each jug that you poured out. So that was an important aspect to their job. In 1851, there was a man named Chinchiki, and he was Chickasaw. He was riding by himself alone, chasing down a group of outlaws. These were some Creek outlaws that had smuggled liquor across the border. So he was trying to chase them down. They were all armed. Chinchiki, however, only had a knife on him. There were 4 men, and 3 of them he killed with his knife. The 4th man managed to get a shot in and caused Chinchiki's death. So this was actually a sensational story at the time. It made the papers. A BIA agent for the Chickasaws wrote a letter to D.C. about Chinchiki and his bravery. We still have a copy of that letter today. He was definitely a brave man and is remembered all these years later.
Life expectancy for the Lighthorse Police was not high, generally speaking. And even routine job duties came with an element of danger when enforcing the laws alone. From cutting wire fences to escorting government annuity payments to tribal headquarters, danger could be lurking around every corner.
And so they would decide right on the spot what kind of punishment someone would get, and then they could carry out their punishment, which often was whippings at that point in time. So for a first offense, you might get 25 lashes, second offense, 50 lashes, and so on.
There might be situations I've seen in my own family, for example, where there were disputes about trying to get rid of somebody off your property, and the Chickasaw police would be called to evict him.
Way over the line, you're cutting down.
You had to make a decision, a judgment call, about who was liable, who was guilty, etc.
And that much power can come with a high price. The badge could become a target if it crossed the wrong path.
Ben Collins was a Chickasaw lawman who had been chasing down a gang and killed one of the gang members. He's back at home with his family, and the gang took retribution upon him and came to his house and killed him in cold blood in front of his wife. She went to the law office, told the sheriff what had happened, and they formed a posse. In that posse was my great-grandfather, who was a U.S. Marshal, and he knew Ben Collins well. And so they chased down the gang that had killed Ben Collins and captured them, and they were jailed for their offense. The life of a light horseman was very rough, sometimes brutal. They would travel for miles on horseback. It was a lonely job.
There was killings all the time. a shootout. I mean, just for nothing. Some of it was over fences. You know, somebody put a fence there and said, that's on my land. No, it's on my land. We have a lot of records of people getting killed over whose land was whose.
They had to be very strong, rugged, really, individuals, and very brave to go out and carry out their tasks and their job duties. So outside of that, it was just really dangerous, and yeah, you could lose your life very easily. They were definitely brave individuals. They had to be on their own. They had to be aware of their surroundings at all times, knowing that they were in danger at any time of being shot. So these are hundreds of miles that they were covering.
We were the wild, wild west.
Especially if they were going after a gang, for instance. It's one of them against maybe 4 or 5 of a gang. So that was a very life-endangering situation.
My great-great-great-grandfather, W.E. McCarty, William Daniel McCarty, he was born on May 10th, 1865, so right at the end of the Civil War. There's not a whole lot that's known about my grandfather's early life.
He was Lighthorse, and he was one of the first lawmen in Tishomingo prior to statehood. He did have to be brave.
In 1887, we actually have a photo of W.D. McCarty along with other Chickasaw Lighthorsemen in a pasture outside of Sulphur, and so we know that he was Lighthorse at that time. He was elected in August 1902 and served as a sheriff until the end of the territory after statehood. I think that it could be dangerous, because you were on your own a lot of times. So the Arbuckle Mountains during the Indian Territory days were known as being somewhat dangerous. A lot of folks who were outlaws would hide out in the mountains. In one case, a bootlegger by the name of Scarface Jim Watson. Scarface Jim Watson, he was hanging out with his wife at some place, and they ended up having a shootout with my grandfather and another lawman, I believe, by the name of Garrett.
He did live to be a lot older than the other Lighthorse. I want to say somewhat lucky to get to live that long because of the amount of danger that he was exposed to.
He spent a lot of his time as a farmer and as a rancher during the 1900s, after the turn of the century there, and after statehood, he bred horses and he sold horses. My family's been in Indian Territory in Oklahoma for, I think, my children are now the 8th generation, and that goes back to the earliest days of Indian Territory. We're proud to know that our ancestor played an important role in Indian Territory's history.
They called him out in his obituary that he was a very well-liked and honorable man.
Even though history is colored with the stories of shootouts and outlaws, the perception that Indian Territory was lawless is not accurate. There was a defined system of justice in place.
Each of the cultures, be they plains or transplanted cultures from the southeast United States, had internal mechanisms for maintaining law and order. There were social barriers and social remedies for problems of any kind. So it wasn't lawless in that sense, but the Indian Territory was looked upon at various times in the late 19th century as a haven for lawless elements out of the neighboring states. For example, a very active horse theft situation going on within the Indian Territory. There were a lot of times they were taking those horses back to Texas and trading them for whiskey and alcohol, and then bringing the alcohol back into the territory as contraband. And that was something that was forbidden. And the tribes did their best to keep it under control.
Stop that wagon!
I think people during this time really respected the Lighthorsemen and almost feared them just a little bit. They had a lot of power since they could carry out this judge, jury, and executioner. I haven't found any records or stories that talked about them being unfair or being bribed, taking bribes, that they were very honest men, they were out to do a job, and they did it well.
The Lighthorsemen served the Chickasaws well. What changed is as society continued to progress and more accumulation of property, more trade with more non-Indians moving closer into North Texas, into eastern part of Kansas, Arkansas being settled.
The influx of non-natives created a complicated situation because the Lighthorse could only enact justice on their own people. And it's during this period of time when additional law enforcement began to patrol Indian nations.
One could be a light horseman, a deputy U.S. Marshal, a U.S. Indian Police, a sheriff, a constable, all the above, one time or the other in their career, or simultaneously. Something like 350 deputy U.S. Marshals were killed in the whole United States during that time period. Almost 50% of them were killed in Oklahoma. So there definitely was a lot of conflict. To name it a lawless area would not be correct.
In 1856, the Chickasaw Nation wrote up their own constitution, and in that constitution, they provided for the development of sheriffs and constables. So the light horse were still in the picture. They were still working, but now they had sheriffs and constables to work alongside and help enforcing the laws. After the development of constables and sheriffs, they were able to enforce the laws upon the non-Indians. So this became a tremendous help in trying to enforce all the laws of Indian Territory. They could arrest them.
But jurisdiction for non-natives ended there. They then had to transport the accused prisoner to a federal facility, sometimes hundreds of miles away.
My great-grandfather, Frank Greenwood, he would take prisoners from that area to Fort Smith, where they had a jail. That's where the hanging judge was. And Frank would take these people, or these bad guys, to Fort Smith to put them in jail. Oh, he had to be tough, I would think, because way back then, they were outlaws, all kinds of mean people.
You've been found guilty by federal law.
They could take them to trial, which was out at Fort Smith with the hanging judge. They couldn't do any executions or whippings on them. They would do that usually by putting the outlaw on a horse, handcuffed, and then just attach a rope to their horse, and then would take him by horseback all the way out there. They were not allowed to kill anybody. If the man did not make it alive out to Arkansas, then the sheriff or constable or light horseman would actually be charged for the man's death and would have to pay for the man's funeral.
In February 1880, the Lighthorse Police were joined on patrol by a new force with badges. Federally assigned law officers through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Indian Police.
Indian police were actually assigned by the U.S. government, and they could represent any tribe. They would be made up of many different tribes. So they would patrol the land, but they had specific areas they were in charge of. And then the same thing with the U.S. Marshals. They were appointed by the U.S. government as well, and then they would be assigned into districts. The influx of non-natives into Indian Territory definitely changed this perception as to what Indian Territory was and who could enforce the laws.
The intruders that were coming in to either settle on land or take advantage business-wise of the tribes created a lot of the lawlessness that we think of today.
In 1901, a former Chickasaw Lawman and representative of the Chickasaw Nation died under suspicious circumstances. His death and the quest for justice would make history in an Indian Territory headed towards statehood.
Thompson Pickens was an ancestor of mine, son of Edmund Pickens. Thompson Pickens was a sheriff and a constable in Pickens County, the western part of the Chickasaw Nation, in the 1890s. He was involved as a posseman, as a deputy under his brother, Dave Pickens, deputy U.S. Marshal, and several situations down on Red River. One shootout they had, an apprehension of killers, happened just east of Lebanon on Red River. Thompson managed to be elected sheriff, constable, and then he made representative in the Chickasaw legislature. For some unknown reason, we have not found the cause, but he and another Chickasaw legislator, a man named Burris, were both arrested at the same time by the city marshal in Tishomingo, a white man, and his deputy. We've never found a statement of charges or an accusation even. They were just arrested. And they were locked up and they were beaten severely while they were in jail with a 2-inch thick hickory board. And it was so bad that it was decided after several days they were going to die. And they didn't want them to die in jail, so they released them in anticipation of death, go home and die. Burris survived, but Thompson Pickens didn't, but he was buried. The Chickasaw Nation suddenly became aware of the fact that 2 of their legislators, one a senator, one a representative, had been beaten severely in this jail, what looked like a hate crime. They appropriated $750 to pay for the prosecution of the marshal and his deputy for murder of Thompson Pickens. When it went for a hearing, the judge said that he needed proof of cause of death because it had been up to 5 weeks since the beating and the death. 2 doctors from Lebanon and a deputy U.S. Marshal and a reporter from the Ardmore newspaper were part of a 4-man team to go and witness the exhumation of Thompson Pickens. An autopsy was conducted by these 2 doctors, a father and son team, and the cause of death was verified that in his front cranium was the impression of a revolver, where he had been hit with a pistol in his front of his skull so severely that it cracked the inside of his skull and caused hemorrhage and severe concussion. That was ruled as cause of death. So the marshal and the deputy were arrested and were confined in the Tishomingo jail initially. But the kicker is, we never found out the outcome of the trial. The circumstances kept changing, the influx was increasing, the tribes were gradually losing control of their own territory.
As Indian Territory approached the turn of the century, Indian police were provided uniforms and government-issued weapons. Historical accounts say the weapons were of inferior quality. Some called them junk weapons.
Did they want those Indians, even though they're representing us, the federal government, in our uniform, do we want them to have a rifle as good as ours? No. We want to have an advantage over them. So this racist attitude, well, we're going to give them token support.
But an important point, and one not to be overlooked, is how the Chickasaw people, their government, and law enforcement approached the challenges of the 20th century, challenges that would only continue as Oklahoma approached statehood.
Dealing with rival jurisdictions, trying to change with the times. What we see in this entire history of law enforcement among the Chickasaws is adaptation, experimentation, but never losing that central idea that these are our laws, Chickasaw laws. This is Chickasaw Nation.
I think that the change was certainly a challenge for a lot of people. For law enforcement, there was a lot of changes that had to happen.
As we approached statehood, we started seeing the dissolution of tribal police, the Lighthorse and the sheriffs and constables.
It left the tribe, our people, without local representation, our local police. We had to rely on the government to provide that, which, maybe days out, maybe sometimes weeks out before they could provide responses to requests from our people for law enforcement needs.
The loss of our control over the laws of our people as it changed around statehood was a significantly sad time for our tribe, but we persevered and we reestablished the Lighthorse in later years.
Well, in 1975, of course, there was a bill that was passed, the Self-Determination Act, that allowed for Native American tribes to operate their own programs separate from the government.
So this is really similar to the way that things are run today with the Lighthorse, because we have this cross-deputization, we can cross jurisdictions, and we work with other tribal police, county police, and city police to enforce the laws today.
Part of sovereignty includes enforcing our own laws and being able to protect our own citizens. There's these individuals, people out there who have these connections to what it means to be a Lighthorse that's over a century old now. And I think that that connection plays pretty strongly in what it means to be an Okie, but also kind of what it means to be Chickasaw here.
Well, here at Lighthorse, we're very proud. The governor has set a very high standard for us, and not only us, but other departments. We feel like training is the key component that brings better services to the people. We're very dedicated to the training process for our officers and for the services that they supply to the Chickasaw people and to our facilities.
I see the Native Americans that were in law enforcement as heroes. They were brave, they were out there enforcing the laws of their land. I think that their role in history as lawmen isn't something that's talked about a lot. You tend to watch what's on TV, and so you don't see that side of the story, but they played a large part in law enforcement, and especially in Indian Territory.
We don't focus on the many people who made small accomplishments, and that really painted the full picture, the mosaic of American history, and that part is important. Unfortunately, Native Americans kind of get relegated to this side note of history.
As a Chickasaw, I am just so proud of our police force in the past and in the present.
We work for the people.
And when I see a Lighthorse Police drive by, it fills me with even more pride.
They were very much a part of what made this country what it is today.